Inside of FormIt now, we're ready to start adding context models of the existing buildings around the site. And to do this, you can see I've got the topography turned on. I have the building footprints, but there's a little bit of a problem that we have with this data. If I simply come across and trace this building footprint, what's going to happen is I'll have 4 points making up this rectangle that are not coplanar. And so they don't close off to actually form a surface for me that I can start extruding. The same situation happens if I come in and do a rectangle. I can get this as a system to come in and form a surface, but oftentimes this surface won't be level. So if I'm extruding along the z-axis, I'm actually kind of extruding sideways, and that's going to mess a lot of things up in my process. So what I typically do at this point when I'm ready to start adding in context buildings is I'm going to turn off my topography layer. And as long as I feel comfortable that my satellite photos and my building outlines are matching up reasonably well, I will rely on the satellite photos for the outlines of the buildings, and I will use the building outlines from Flux for final placement. So I'm going to turn this off. Now that I have that layer off, I know I am going to be drawing exactly on the XY axis. Lines that can be either on or slightly off axis in our case, but primarily on the XY plane. So I'm going to use my line drawing tool and zoom in and start at this corner. And I'm going to zoom in on the front corner of the building. And 120 feet and 1/2 of an inch is kind of a bad number to me. The more I can round things off, sort of the happier I am. So I'm just going to type that in as 120. For the front edge, this east edge, I'm going to look for the purple reference line, purple perpendicular, easy way to remember that one. And we'll tab and do 50 feet. And now I'm going to use that purple reference again. I'm going to hold the shift down to lock that in place and use the back edge, 120 feet, and close that off. And I now have a rectangle that is ready to pull up. So I need to look at Street View as a really good, reliable source for estimating building heights. Really simple method to use that we've found is this little square is right at 7 feet, plus or minus. Even if we're off a little bit, as long as we are close, it gets us through sort of this pre-design phase with a good understanding of the relationship of the building heights rather than just a random number. So I'm just going to use this to hover and count up the outside surface. So there's 1, 2, just below that white line, 3, just below the window mullions, 4, and just on top of this, 5. So I'm going to estimate this right at 35, perhaps 36 feet. And while I've got this sort of nice square on view, I'm also going to use print screen and put that file directly into Photoshop. File, new, OK, edit, paste, and then I need to crop off my screencasting software and my cheat sheet. And I'm going to go just sort of to the outside edge of the building as a starting point. I'm going to go back to Street View really quick and just kind of help everybody understand this little square here that tracks around a surface. Let's look at a taller building back around this direction. And you'll see that this little bitty square guy right here, I don't know what to call it. I haven't been able to find an official name for it. But again, if I hover over a door, it is right at 7. And as I track that up vertically, you'll see it actually works over the surface of that building and follows the vanishing lines of the building. Now, for something like this, I wouldn't try and count all the way up. This is repetitive. I would get to a certain point, understand my floor to floor, and then simply multiply up by how many levels there are. But this is a really convenient trick to use when we're sort of estimating heights and you don't want to get into the idea of counting bricks. And you need to be a little bit quicker and also make sure that things at least are in proportion around the site. So let's go back into Photoshop. And inside of Photoshop, what I want to do is pull this out of perspective. So I'm going to pull in guides, and I always go inside. I never want to rely on Photoshop to invent pixels for me. I would rather squish pixels than invent pixels. That way I can keep my resolution a little bit better. So I'm going to use my guides on the bottom edges. And so this idea of squishing pixels rather than inventing them will hopefully make a little bit of sense here in just a second. Select all. And typically I use transform distort. There is transform perspective, but distort is just a little bit faster for me to work through corner by corner. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull in each edge so that I'm creating vertical lines that match everything up. I can pull out this edge, match that back to my guides. And again, I could waste a lot of time doing something like this. I would rather get through it quickly because I'm not looking to be super precise. I'm looking to be within a foot. So I'll accept that, select, deselect, and now I'm going to crop to my edges. And then I'm going to save this file as a JPEG. And that JPEG file I can map onto my surface inside of FormIt. So the naming convention that I'll typically use is the street address. So this is 1830 Main East Elevation. Save, and we'll just overwrite that file. And then we'll go back into FormIt. So we were 36 feet tall. So I'm going to start pulling that surface up. Use the tab key to enter 36 feet. Then I'm going to go to my material browser. And I've already made this once preparing for this. So let's go ahead and delete that and we'll recreate it again. So create new material. So this material name is 1830 Main East. My horizontal scale, the width of the building was 50 feet. My height, 36. Let's grab that texture map, 1830 Main East. Say OK. And now we are ready to map that onto that east elevation surface. So this gives us the opportunity, if I am looking for something that just gets me the visual, that might be a good place to stop. But this is something I'm going to want to 3D print. This is something that in VR, I'm less interested in that as a surface map, and I'm more interested in it as sort of a surface relief or a surface texture. So I'm going to go ahead and begin adding a little bit of detail so I can actually get rid of the map and leave that as just a flat matte white surface with a little bit of relief detail on it, pushing the windows out, pushing the windows in, pulling the awnings and things like that out. So I want to start with this roof edge, and I won't bore you with a video that takes through everything. I'll just go far enough so that you get the idea of how to accomplish a reasonable amount of detail in a short amount of time. So I'm going to use my line tool again and start on this first edge. And I want to draw a line back. Let's make this front edge about 2 feet wide. And again, I'm going to watch for that purple line and map directly across that. I'm going to grab this back surface and pull it down just below the height right there. Make sure everything's looking good. And now let's add in, I believe we need about 4 more lines. 1, 2, 3, 4 more lines to make the front edge of this building. So we'll use the line tool. And again, I'm going to look for that purple reference. There we go. 1, too close, too close, back, 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 over, over, over. Here we go. Purple reference line, hold shift, 2, much easier to line those up. Purple reference line, and last piece. And again, not being overly concerned about just being crazy precise. You can spend hours working this stuff and really not reap the benefits of it. But I want sort of the right character for these things. So I select both of those surfaces and I'm just going to pull them down. And now I can select an edge and shift click to select this next edge. And I'll pull those edges down. And again, I'm going to look for that dark blue z-axis reference line. And then let's pick the top surface, shift click the top surface of the next piece, and then we're going to pull those down right to the top there. And so you can see right away I already have sort of the beginning of the right kind of character for that front edge. So something like windows are a little bit tricky because inside of FormIt, if I make a new piece of geometry on this surface, so let's just say I'm going to map out on the face the block where this window is, it's going to remap my surface. So let's undo that. And while it's not bad if I only have a few things, it can get really confusing and a little bit difficult to read. And it also becomes a little bit tricky to sort of gauge window to window when I have repetitive elements. And I know that top line, even if they're not matching up perfectly in the photograph, I know that physically that top line is really nice and consistent. So what I do is before I close off and make a solid piece of geometry inside of this, a complete rectangle, I essentially draw in guides. So I'm going to come across this top edge and leave it open. And then I'm going to come across the bottom edge and leave that open. And then I know the stop and starting locations are correct. And I'll put in just a few additional guides, like that is where I need this window, and that is where I need the second window. And so those give me lines that then I can quickly make those windows once I lose the map. And I can do the same thing. Losing the map will make sense here in just a second. Let's do the same thing for the awnings. So I'm going to come across and make sure I'm on my surface and down. And I'm going to use that same line again and make sure it comes all the way across. Actually, I don't want to do it that way. Let's do a reference line from here to here, an inference line. So I'm selecting this edge. That's where I want to start my line. I'm holding down Shift to lock to that edge, and I'm using the top of this guideline here to begin drawing my line. Come to the awning, and come down. And so I have a few things drawn in now. And again, I would go through and draw in all of the key elements that I need. And then using a new material that I've created just called Existing Building, which is just sort of a matte white, I'm going to paint that texture map off. Doing that allows me to really quickly complete these edges. 1, 2, 3, 4. And there's an awning and an awning. So I can delete these extra lines that I don't need. Not the point, but the actual line. And so those are ready to both push in. So I'll shift click both of those and push them back in by 6 inches. And again, I hit the tab key to set that up as a precise dimension. And these two awnings are ready to pull out by, I don't know, 4 feet. Sounds great. And then let's push those top corners back in along that edge by 3 feet to build those awnings. So you can see really quickly, leveraging that photo mapping technique, I can start to build in these additional details that I need, including simple little things like there's that great big sign that comes right through here. Just sketch that in really fast. About 1 foot wide, seems right about on it. Again, we'll come this direction. 6 inches vertically up. Delete that middle line. We'll pull that surface out. And if you notice, I've done something terribly wrong there. I do not have that set up as coplanar. One of those lines is just a little bit, even just slightly, will mess everything up off that surface. So let's go ahead. Well, let's try one thing really quick. It might be that it's not closed off on the top. Nope, it's not the case. So I'm going to use the tab button. It's great to show mistakes sometimes. Use the tab button to select all of those lines and delete them. And let's try that one more time. See if I can do a little bit better job. So let's use our line tool. I want to find right about the midpoint of that surface. Through the midpoint of the back. That's not good. When examples go wrong. That's great. Okay, let's pull that down once again. And let's go over and up. Maybe I'll use a slightly different technique this time. Because that closed off, let's just do it this way. We'll pull that surface out. And then I'll just pull this surface over another 6 inches. Get the same kind of effect. I know that that marquee sign extended up above the top of the parapet. So we'll do something like that. And so that begins to work as a complete system for me. Now the next thing that I need to do, if I turn my topography lines back on, or my topography surface back on, the building, this one is close to 0, 0, so it's going to be set reasonably well, but a lot of the other buildings are not. I'm going to be making them buried pretty far underground. So let's take a look at moving this vertically before I get any further. So a couple of steps to do that. First thing that's really helpful when you're working on a lot of different objects is I want to go ahead and make this a group. So I'm going to double click on it to select all of the geometry. I'm going to right click and make it a group. Underneath that group's properties, I want to give that a name. So again, that's 1830 East Main. And I'm going to set it to my existing buildings layer. So at any point in the time, I can go to my layers and turn off existing buildings. From there, now I can select that really easily, and it's also not going to stick to any other surfaces. I can move that vertically to make sure that I'm both not cutting off bottoms of windows or bottoms of doors, things like that, and I can make sure that the building is sitting correctly on the topography surface. So to do that, what I'll typically do is select it, and I'm going to move the bottom edge of the building up. So I'm making sure that I have that blue reference line. So I'm going to move it up above the topo surface, then I'm simply going to move it back down until it's on the face. And I'm pretty happy with that. I mean, that's a pretty simple result. But you can see it's not quite covering all of the building. The topo surface comes in. And again, minor issue for this building because it's not happening. There's not a lot of topographic change across this building. But there are going to be other times where it's pretty drastic, where I actually need to make the building a little bit taller to extrude underneath the ground. So even though it's not an issue on this building, I'm going to use this as an example in terms of how I work around that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the building again, select it, and I'm going to push it vertically up by a given number, in this case 50 feet. Okay, so it is 50 feet above where I know I want that building to be. I'm going to double click to edit the geometry from that group. I'm going to select the bottom face and I'm going to pull it down. In this case, I'm just going to pull it down, tab, let's pull it down 10 feet. So that's a little bit extreme, but it's okay. Now I can just take this entire surface again, or this entire object again, and I'm going to move it back down, tab, by 50 feet. And what that's going to do is that's going to bury a larger portion of the building below the topography, but it's going to ensure that there's no point around the perimeter that I can actually see underneath the building or have a floating building. So if I go back in to my materials, I'm going to edit that site material, make it completely opaque, okay, and then you can see how that's going to work. And you can also see, if we get sort of into the topography, how one is cutting into the other, which should be perfectly fine for most 3D printing softwares. It should just take that over and understand that those two working together are solid objects. When I get into modeling context outside, let's turn this material back to semi-transparent. Once I get beyond the edge of my satellite photograph, I have a couple of options. I can go back to using these. I can expand the satellite photograph, or I can just go to a brand new file. And typically what I will do is go to a brand new file. If I import the satellite image again, it is actually going to shift that new satellite image back to being centered at the 0, 0, 0 coordinate system. So I'm going to have to model buildings and then move them in the X and Y direction. What I typically would do is go to simply start a brand new FormIt file, file new, import a satellite image, let's say for this block of buildings, model those, import them in as a group, and move them to the right location. I find that to be much faster and a little bit more accurate, and so I'm ultimately using these lines as guides for the final placement for any of the buildings outside of this satellite photograph.